Hello, welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me again. In this session, we'll be talking about healthcare specifically. Now, this particular section has the potential to be quite upsetting and may feel very close to home for those, especially who are working in hospital or other clinical situations. However, we must learn about these biases in order to address them properly. We must be able to see more of the big picture ourselves in order to be able to do what is in our power to prevent injustices that are happening within our reach. I want to remind you to take very good care of yourself during this section. And remember, if you need to take a break, that's okay. Please do so, and then please come back to it. There are some biases about Indigenous people that influence how they are treated everywhere. But in the instances of seeking medical care, these biases can literally take someone's life. Many of these things are happening at a systemic level. That means they're happening over and over and over again. I'm here to remind you that these systems that we operate in are made up of individuals. So you have the power to change things, at least where you work and at least when you're on shift. We're not going to talk about all of the biases that exist about Indigenous people, but I am going to mention a few examples with a few of my thoughts, and I will leave you with some resources to learn more about this in the resource section. So the first bias that I want to talk about is Indigenous peoples are not human. This bias comes from the doctrine of discovery, on which every piece of legislation in this country is based. It shows up everywhere, but especially in healthcare, education, policing, childcare, child welfare, rehabilitation, retail, and social situations. Indigenous people do not feel pain the way we do. This bias comes from the time of residential schools and the era where medical experiments were being performed on Indigenous people without their knowledge or consent. While residential schools have been closed, these practices have not gone away. They've merely changed forms. It's important to understand that some of this research, which was done in these non-consensual experiments, is how we ended up with Canada's food guide that is still being used today. This is definitely one of the reasons why Indigenous people may have trouble trusting medical professionals. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention another very prominent reason, which is that many Indigenous women have been sterilized without their knowledge or consent. Indigenous peoples are only good for sex. This bias is pretty specific, and it comes from a story of what happened to Joyce Echaquan. But stories just like this are happening all the time, everywhere. This particular bias also contributes to the MMIWG2S epidemic that exists. As mentioned before, Indigenous people are being simultaneously overpoliced and underpoliced. People in professional roles are very quick to report Indigenous people for different things. Perhaps it is possible there are some situations where people don't realize the harm that they are causing, but with everything we know now about racism and the history and the present state of how Indigenous people are treated here, I invite you to do better and to encourage your colleagues in this regard. There are some reports you can read to help you understand, such as the In Plain Sight, the Misconduct, Missing, and Murdered, Anti-Indigenous Racism in Reproductive Healthcare, and Our Health Counts reports, which are linked in the resources. When it comes to the disease of COVID-19, which is caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2, we know now that marginalized communities are having the worst outcomes. At the time of recording this course, It is still the third leading cause of death in Canada. Marginalized people are having the worst outcomes for other illnesses as well, but SARS-CoV-2 is a preventable virus. Due to having been politicized, it is now being spread unmitigated everywhere in all settings. We are all vulnerable to this virus. It does not affect only the vulnerable. Certainly, there are people who already know that they are vulnerable and are taking extra precautions to protect themselves, especially now that the public health protections are no longer being mandated. Those patients should be supported, not pathologized for having anxiety. If we are to consider ourselves caring people, we must take responsibility for our own actions in light of current circumstances. Just because something is no longer being mandated does not mean that we're off the hook. The precautionary principle is still the wisest course of action. The problems that we're seeing with huge outbreaks of other illnesses are definitely being exacerbated by long-term effects of COVID infections. I'm going to invite you to read a report that was released by Stats Canada in December of 2023 for more information on the status of these long-term effects and to familiarize yourself with how common they are. 1 in 5 people have had at least one COVID infection now in Canada, and 1 in 9 people have what is now being called long COVID. As healthcare professionals, your primary responsibility is to do no harm to your patients or clients. If you are not requiring airborne transmission precautions in your workplaces, you are causing harm to your patients or clients. I implore you to advocate for these measures to protect yourselves and your patients. If you don't have the authority to mandate such guidelines, the very least you can do is break the chains of transmissions through your own person by wearing adequate PPE that includes an N95 or better respirator and eye protection. If you're not informing your patients or clients about the risks of contracting COVID and how to protect themselves, you are also doing them a disservice. This, of course, is ideally the role of public health, but because the virus and mitigations to prevent it have become politicized, their reach has been diminished. What I see happening right now in regards to COVID is 100% an extension of colonization. The spread of disease was one of the earliest tools of colonization in the genocides of Indigenous peoples. I urge you to read up on and to understand the airborne nature of this disease, the way airborne transmission occurs, and how to prevent forward transmission. There will be some linked reading in the resources. Informed consent in your practice includes COVID information and safety from airborne transmission in your healthcare practice. Without you sharing it with them, your patients or clients may not have the best access to information on COVID or how to protect themselves. You owe this to your patients. As healthcare professionals, this is modeling best practices for your own communities as well. And lastly, please remember that your patients know themselves best. They have been in their bodies for their whole lives. Listen carefully. If they say something is wrong, believe them. And I invite you to have a little bit of humility and curiosity and do your best to help them. Thank you, miigwech. Get seated comfortably. Close your eyes if it feels comfortable to do so. Gently bring your attention to your breathing. Notice as you breathe in and out. Notice where each in-breath begins and where it turns and becomes an out-breath. Notice the spaces between breaths. Whenever you begin to feel your mind wandering, that's okay. You can always reconnect by bringing your attention back to your breath. You can bring it back as many times as needed. Just keep coming back to the breath. Take a deep cleansing breath and imagine roots growing from under your feet and your seat. These roots grow deep into the earth. The earth holds you and loves you and provides you with everything you need. You may wish to think thoughts of gratitude for keeping you grounded during your practice and for providing you with everything you need. Take another deep cleansing breath and imagine a tiny silver thread coming out of the top of your head and going up. This thread connects you to your divinity, Creator, God, the universe, whoever or whatever your higher power, and is the source of unconditional love. You may wish to think thoughts of gratitude for keeping you connected to your divinity. Remember that you are a sacred being. Imagine energy coming up through your roots and providing you with all the support you need, and energy coming from above you, pure love, through your silver thread. This energy flows and meets right in your heart center. In your heart center, imagine a light. There is an awareness that is you. When you tune into this space, you'll be able to see, hear, sense guidance from your truest self for your image. Now tune into your emotional self and notice how you're feeling emotionally. There is no wrong feeling. Try not to judge your emotion, just notice it. Now tune into your physical self and notice how you feel in your body in the physical space. Notice where your body is touching the floor and cushion. Notice if you have any tension or sore spots anywhere in your body. Send some extra tender loving kindness to those spots. You may want to use your hands if you can reach these spots. Gently and lovingly hold the place or places that need extra care. Now tune in to your mental self and notice your thoughts. Try not to judge your thoughts, just notice them. Think about your intention for your painting and hold it in your heart. Slowly, begin to bring your awareness back to the room. Take 3 more deep cleansing breaths. Gently begin to wiggle your fingers and toes. Gently make a few small circles with your neck. Now the other way. When you feel ready, open your eyes and come back to the room. This next step is incorporating your symbology. We're also going to use this step to incorporate some pattern. So I think for my painting, I want to add a little bit more greenery over here. I'm going to wet my canvas a little bit in the areas where I want to work. And I'm going to begin with some green paint. I think I'm going to try to make a little bit of a pattern that looks like leaves or foliage. That's going to be a bit more in the background of this work. And I'm going to use that small spongy brush again that we were using before to go ahead and get some paint there. And I'm just going in and adding some texture. During this step, you want to find a brush or another tool that makes the shape of the thing you're trying to make. So if you're trying to make leaves on a tree, for example, you'd want to find a brush that is leaf shaped. That will really help. This one's looking a little bit darker, which is nice. One tip that I have for you is when you're adding things, sometimes it's nice to have an odd number. So these patterns that I'm adding in that kind of look like trees, I'm putting in 3 trees. You could also use the number 5 or 7. I recommend an odd number. It's a design trick. And it is dripping a little bit, but I kind of like that. I really like during this style of painting to really let the paint do what it wants. It's really going to add a lot of character to your work. You could also, during this step, you could also use a stencil to add in some pattern in your work. I recommend waiting until your painting is a little bit drier before you go in with a stencil. So let's take a pause here and then I'll show you how to go in with a stencil. Okay, now that that part is dry, I can show you another way of incorporating symbology into your work, which is using a stencil. So for this example, I've got a stencil of some birch trees that I want to use, and I want them to appear to be a little bit behind those trees. So I'm going to put them up here. And a tip that I have for you when working with a stencil is that you don't want your stencil to move. So I'm going to use some masking tape to get this stencil in the place that I want it. To be right about there. I'm going to attach it in 2 places. At least 2 places. Okay, now I'm going to use, actually I'm going to put one more tape. I'm using masking tape so that it comes up easily without pulling off the paint behind. And I'm going to use a light color, I think. I'm going to use some Naples yellow and white. So it's going to be hopefully a very light tan color. I'm going to use a synthetic brush to mix the color. Until it's fully mixed, until it's the color that I want. Again, if you're mixing a color on your palette and you don't like the color, don't put it on your palette. Don't put it on your painting. You can always remix your color, but once it's on your painting, if you don't like that color, it's pretty hard to cover it up. Although, with acrylic paint, if you do have something on your painting that you don't like, all you have to do is let that paint dry, and then you'll be able to paint over it. So for this stencil work, I'm going to use a sea sponge. So what I'm going to do is dip the sea sponge in the paint and then gently press onto the stencil, being careful not to move it. And because I want it to look like these birch trees are behind those trees, I'm going to avoid the areas where it overlaps these trees. That way it'll help to add to the illusion that these trees are behind that. And I'm also going to avoid this area which is covered by this sun. So go ahead, get some paint on there. And then get in here with my sponge. When you're working with a sponge and stencils, it's best to press down rather than side to side, because what could happen is you could get paint that seeps in between the stencil and your canvas. So just using a bit of care in these areas where these items are that I'm trying not to cover. And then the rest is pretty simple, just dabbing it to get the effect I want. You don't want your sponge to be wet, and you want the paint to be pretty undiluted. So for example, don't use a wet brush to mix that color, and don't use a wet sponge for this. Otherwise, your colors will run under the stencil. There we go. Now, you want to put your sponge in water if you're using a sponge so that you can use it again. And you want to let this dry a little bit before you start peeling the stencil off. I'm going to go ahead, just for time's sake, being very careful. So those are two ways you can start to incorporate your symbology into your work. Another way that you can do that is to incorporate the energy of the thing you want. So if you wanted feathers, let's say you were painting a bird, you could find a brush that mimics feathers and then get in there. And really, during this stage, it's all about repetition and repeating your patterns. So this is a really good stage of the painting to allow you to go into a meditative state and to relax and to do those repetitive motions to really build up the pattern in your symbology. And the last thing that I want to do during this step is, if you remember during my sketching portion of this image, there was something right about here that I wasn't really sure what it is. Now I'm pretty sure that that thing is some blueberries, which are very important to black bears. So this is going to be a great example for you of how to add something in, even if you've already started filling in with color blocking and your pattern and symbology. So the way I'm going to do that is using my charcoal again. I'm going to add in some blueberries here. And I'm going to use that trick that I mentioned about using an odd number. So this is a design trick. I'm going to draw 5 blueberries. And I'm going to add in some leaves as well. I'm going to use that trick again. I'm going to put in 3 leaves. It's okay if you don't get the lines exactly right. You can go over it again and just make a mental note to yourself which line you want to follow. That one. And that one. Actually, I think I want those blueberries to be a little bit bigger, so I'm just going in again with my charcoal, making them a little bit bigger. And I'm going to make a mental note of which line to follow. Okay, so that was adding in another symbol. And again, when you come to the part where you want to outline something, you want to use a high contrast color. In this case, I've already got some black lines here and I don't want to confuse myself for this step. So for this step, I'm going to outline them with white. Just need a little bit of paint for this step. Again, when you're outlining, I recommend using a round synthetic brush. This is the one I chose this time. The round synthetic brush will give you smoother lines. going to outline those leaves. And I've changed my mind about this line, this leaf, so I'm just not going to outline that. I'm going to let this paint dry. Now that this is dry, I can go ahead and clean it up a little bit. I've got my rag here. I'm just wiping it to remove that excess charcoal that I had on there. And anytime you add something to your painting, you could add something anytime. This has the outline on it now, but we need to get this section back up to this level with our painting. So we're going to go backwards a little bit, going to do the color blocking step and filling that in a little bit, as I said, to bring it up to this level. So again, you don't have to really be thinking about the final color palette yet. So I don't really need to think about what color blueberries are or the leaves. And I think for this step, I might use a light blue for the leaves and pink for the blueberries. I think that will add a nice undertone. And I'm using a little bit of white on this because, as I mentioned, the white is a bit more opaque than the other colors, meaning that you can't really see through it as well as the other colors. And by adding a little bit of white, it's going to help me get a little bit more coverage for these other lines that are appearing behind that I want to cover. So I'm using, this color is quinacridone magenta, one of my favorite colors, with some white to make pink. And I'm going to use a drop of this phthalo blue to make the light blue color. Again, I'm going to mix these colors with a synthetic brush. Okay, that's good. Mix that up. Gives us some nice colors. I'm not mixing very much because these are both very small areas. So I'm going to do the pink first because phthalo blue is very hard to get off of your brush. It will very much influence the other colors. So I'm going to use this one first. Again, I'm dipping my brush in that color and then moving to another area on my palette. See that my previous color is still influencing that. It's becoming almost a purple. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to work some of that out on my rag. Let me try that again. Okay, that's a little bit better. It's pink now. And I'm just going to go in with my dry scrubby brush, circular scrubby motions to fill that in. It doesn't matter if the paint goes outside of my line and actually covers some of my line a little bit. I personally like that. I think it adds something to the work. It gives it some more character, and As you can see, because I had added the white in there, it did give me some extra coverage, so I was able to cover up those lines behind that I wanted to cover. And now let me just wipe off most of this pink color, which is starting to look a little bit mauve again, but that's okay. I really do like to let the paint do what it's going to do. And now I'm going to repeat that again, dip my brush in the light blue color that I mixed up. Again, moving to another section on my palette that's dry, and using that circular motion again to embed some paint in my brush. And now I'm going to go in here again, circular motion, trying to fill that space and cover those lines behind. Okay, now I want to let that dry a little bit, and then I'm going to bring in another 3 colors again, very little of 3 colors, to do the light, dark, and then transition with a medium to give it a little bit more of a 3-dimensional look. Should not take very long for that to dry. Here. Start thinking about what colors I might like to use. Maybe a little bit of purple. So again, this is very small. These are very small areas, so I don't need very much paint. I am going to get myself set up here where I can have 3 levels of this color. With a little bit of white. And that's feeling dry enough. So again, I'm going to mix my colors with a synthetic brush because I find it easier to mix colors that way. I'm starting with the medium color, and then I'm doing the light color. They're actually looking pretty similar, so maybe I'm going to add something to the medium color. That was a little bit of quinacridone crimson. And then I mixed that into the darker color so that they all have the same color palette. Going to start with the light again on this area. So I've got a little bit of that color on my brush, and then somewhere else on my palette, doing some circular motions to embed that color in the brush. Coming in around the edges. I'm seeing this is a subtle color change, so you might not be able to see it on camera. light around the edges. And maybe I will just add a little bit of medium in here. I'm coming over the edge a little bit. And a little bit of dark in the middle. And I think I want to repeat that in reverse, so I'm going to let that dry. And I've got to think about another set of colors for the leaves. Blue, maybe. I've got blue in there already. It's going to be green at the end. Maybe a little bit of yellow just for something different. You don't have to be realistic with your colors. You can use any colors you like. Maybe I'll add something to that. On one side, whoops. Okay, I've got a light yellow, a light orange, and I would say a little bit darker of a coral color. I'm going to just grab a new brush. So, in with the light. More in the middle. Dark on the outside. That's going to help use that stark difference next to the sun. Anytime you've got a color on your brush, think about and ask yourself if your painting wants any of that color anywhere else. And I think my painting wants some of this coral color on the outside of my blueberries here as well. This will help, as I said, soften the transition between the blueberries and the sun. And yeah, I'm really liking that effect. So I'm just going to keep going with it. If you find that you've got something that's working for you, just keep going with that. I don't want to go too far out. There we go. And then go in with the medium color. It's like a nice light orange. And then soften that transition between your light and your medium. Okay, now I'm gonna go back to my blueberries. I think that's pretty well dry enough. And I want to put some light in the middle. Oops. Wipe that color off. Back into that medium color. And the dark color. Dark color around the outside. There. And I was trying not to be too precious about that. I don't really want super defined edges around that just yet. And I'm going to let that dry a bit and then come back in and strengthen some of those lines. So we'll just let that dry and be right back. Okay, now this is dry enough. I want to go back in with a round synthetic brush. I'm going to choose a smaller one this time. Let's just show you the brush that I'm going to use, a small round synthetic brush. And I'm going to use black to outline this because that will help me reincorporate it into the rest of the main components of this painting. Back in there with the black and gently outline those blueberries. And the leaves. Now I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to go in again with a very light yellow like I did on the bear. That's not going to take very long to dry, so I'm going to go ahead and mix up that super light yellow. So again, to do that, I'm using a drop of white and just a touch of yellow. Doesn't have to be exactly the same. Not really what we're going for. And again, I'm not going to go all the way around edge to edge in the line. I'm just going to add a little bit in some areas, gently. Just helps to give it a little bit more character. Okay, now that is incorporating your symbology.